Well, welcome, history lovers. Greetings. Welcome to the History Changes podcast, Breaking the Social Contract. Today, we have a very special guest with us, is historian Alan McPherson. Alan McPherson is a Fernie Professor of History and Director of the Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy at Temple University. He's an award-winning author of dozens of articles and chapters, the latest of which on the Iran-Contra affair was published in the Journal of American History in 2025. He's also written or edited 12 books. The latest being The Breach, Iran-Contra and the Assault on American Democracy. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the History Changes podcast. I have the book here with me. The Breach. This is a great book, by the way. I just want to say, for the academic or just a lover of history, it's a really, really well-written book, and it's a pretty exciting book too, because it kind of takes a really important piece of history that I think has been somewhat trivialized and demonstrates like really how significant it is, particularly to our current world and our current democracy. Alan McPherson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And thank you, by the way, for reviewing the book.
It was my pleasure. It was really exciting when Silky asked me to do that. So it was my pleasure, and it's a great book.
Thank you.
So the first thing, let's just start off with something really basic, but not something that might be basic to all of the listeners. And that is, can you just kind of give us just a very basic understanding of what the Iran-Contra affair, the Iran-Contra scandal was all about?
Sure, I'm happy to do it. It all takes place in the 1980s during the Reagan presidency. But essentially it stems from two revolutions that both begin in 1979, completely separate from themselves. And the response to both of those from the Reagan presidency, the Reagan administration, creates two separate schemes that at some point will cross and become the Iran-Contra scandal. So you can think of them sort of in this Venn diagram, right? So for a while, the two circles are separate. The first one is Iran, and it follows upon the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which is Islamist, very anti-American, and Iran becomes this sort of pariah regime in the Middle East. And one of the things that it does is that it funds several terrorist cells and groups around the Middle East. One thing they do is take American hostages. So Reagan comes into power wanting to free the hostages. At some point, it's suggested to him directly and to his cabinet, or at least the foreign policy folks in it, that they could exchange missiles in fact, they could sell missiles to the Iranians. And on top of getting money for the missiles, they could possibly get hostages. It's a very touchy negotiation. Iranians hate Americans. Um, but and it's also sort of highly illegal. It's also against policy because Reagan has said he's not going to negotiate with terrorists, and this would be exactly that. So when it blows up, they sort of start doing this in 84, 85, then it blows up. It becomes public knowledge in the fall of 1986, and that's the Iran part of this. Quite separately from this is the Contra part. So again, in 1979, you got a revolution. This one is socialists. It's in Nicaragua. It overthrows a US-supported dictator. Reagan, of course, despises this revolution because it's socialist, and he imagines that it's going to threaten the United States. And so he increases the funding to these Contra rebels, these counter-revolutionary rebels. So these are folks who want to, some of them want to bring back the dictatorship, some of them want a democracy. It's all muddled up. But essentially, it's a very risky gambit. The Congress decides by the sort of 83, 84, they're going to cut off aid to anybody in the US government who deals in intelligence, if they in any way are helping the Contras, right? Militarily helping the Contras, because the Congress says we don't want to be involved in this war anymore. We sense this is going to be another Vietnam. By the way, I've seen videos online explaining that the Congress cut off money because the Contras were dealing drugs. That is not true. In fact, if anything, the Contras deal drugs because the Congress cuts off their money, but they do deal drugs. So that is also a secret war. Reagan knows less about this, but he's the one who gives the order to sort of keep the Contras alive, despite the United States government not being able to give them any money. Um, and so Reagan is very much responsible for both of these things. Now, actually implementing them, the responsibility goes to the National Security Council. And within that, specifically to one man, Oliver North, a lieutenant colonel. And at some point, Oliver North, either he comes up with the idea or it's suggested to him to take some of the money from the Iran deal and give it to the Contras, right, who need money because Congress has told the president you cannot fund them. So you can see that that in itself, the diversion of those funds is quite controversial. And that also comes out, all this comes out in October, November of 1986 and becomes linked as the Iran-Contra scandal. It's got several different names, but eventually the one that sticks is Iran-Contra.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I want to ask how you how you came to this project because Iran-Contra. I mean, my dad was in the service when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. I remember this stuff well. In the 80s and 90s, Iran-Contra, particularly in the early 90s, was still on people's minds, I guess. And unlike Watergate, it kind of got trivialized, and there wasn't really a whole lot in the 21st century really written about it. And so I'm curious, like, and some of this could be for our students, or just people who are thinking about how you develop a good thesis. How did you come across this topic? How did it occur to you so that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the core thesis of the book is that this is like an antecedent for a modern democratic crisis. So we're looking at Iran-Contra, and you're looking at this and basically examining how this is like a breach of sort of core principles of the American democracy, which is a really thought-provoking approach. How did you come across this? What inspired you to do this work?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I mean, there are sort of long-term inspirations and more short-term ones. Long-term is that, like you, I knew about this when I was, in my case, a teenager. I remember watching the hearings on TV and just sort of thinking, like, what's going on in America? In fact, I'm Canadian, and so I was watching American television, going like, why does everybody, why is everyone so enamored of Oliver North and think that there's nothing wrong with what he's done? It was so obvious what he had done. Um, and so I was quite critical of it. But at the same time, my sense, I think, was the sense of most other people, which is that, well, all the facts are out. There's nothing else really to be known about this. And that was generally true. There's not a lot of documents that have come out since then that force us to reassess what it was, or sort of what happened. Other documents have come out, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, especially through court cases, but nothing overwhelming that tells us this is a totally different crisis than what we thought it was. I do think that people mostly forgot about it because there was no impeachment that came out of this, no impeachment of the president. That's the big difference between Watergate and this one. And because of the impeachment, it also creates a majority of Democrats in the Congress, and then they change all these laws. In fact, Iran-Contra is often a response to the increasing power of Congress over foreign policy, right? So the Republicans are now rebelling against the Democrats who they feel have sort of constrained them in foreign policy. And you can certainly have a perfectly legitimate debate about that, but that's clearly what happens. People like Oliver North are very angry. Plus, he's angry that they, lost in Vietnam, and he thought, the United States could have won. There's all these issues going on. Um, and so, as a historian of US Latin American relations, I've always wanted to write about it, had no idea really how to approach the topic, right? Because it wasn't going to be through new documents. Um, and then the 2019 first impeachment of Donald Trump came. And if you remember, it's got to do with foreign policy. He has this phone call with Zelensky in Ukraine, right? The perfect phone call. There are quid pro quos in it. It creates an impeachment, and hearings in Congress. Um, there's clear obstruction of justice. There's breaking of laws. There's lying. There's blaming the media. There's all these sort of anti-democratic behaviors during that impeachment. Um, and as I remember driving and listening to these hearings and going, wow, this sounds a lot like Iran-Contra. and that kind of hit me like, okay, maybe that's how we can re-understand Iran-Contra. Because one of the problems with Iran-Contra not only is that there's not enough consequences to it or punishment, but it's really a crisis of the Cold War in many ways. And so, it's a lot of it is sort of due to the zeal of people who were such big Cold Warriors that they abuse their power. That's a legitimate way of understanding it. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, but then once the Cold War is over, people forget about it, right? It's so this mining, we win the Cold War. It's a minor speed bump at the end of it. We abused our power a little bit. Most people who still love Reagan and historians of Reagan will say that's the one dark chapter. I mean, literally, the negative chapter in these biographies of Reagan is always Iran-Contra. That's the one where it's like biographers cannot excuse what happened. And so I thought, there's sort of two ways you can decide to write um, or sort of rewrite a history of something well known. One is that new revelations, right? Or just a new interpretation. And I thought, well, I don't have number one, but I've got number two. I've got a new interpretation. And it's relevant to today because things have gotten so much worse. And so that was the
Yeah,
inspiration.
yeah, and it's really thought-provoking and really relevant. And that takes me to another question. And this is because this is kind of the backbone of the whole book. So we just do a brief, but in the book, you're really engaging like six core standards of like a healthy democracy that Iran-Contra has breached, right? Um, can you like just briefly talk about those six standards and that Iran-Contra is sort of violating? And are there any of those that you think of those six, one or two that you think are like kind of more significant than the other in terms of the challenge or the threat to a healthy representative system?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I'll try to go kind of quickly through them. There's sort of like six behaviors that threaten standards of democracy or norms of democracy. Or they are norms themselves and they're being threatened by obvious behaviors. The one that was obvious at the time and, probably is one of the most important ones in a democracy is the separation of powers. And you can see that clearly in Iran-Contra, where the administration or the executive, right, whether it's Oliver North or the CIA or Reagan, have really no respect for Congress, especially when it comes to foreign policy. They really think that Congress shouldn't have anything to do with it. They embrace the unitary executive theory sort of for the first time. And they say, even though the law and the Constitution says you have these powers over us in foreign policy, we don't agree. So we're just going to lie to you. We're going to keep information from you. We're going to go around you, right? So that's a major one. And clearly, in the 80s, people described Iran-Contra as a constitutional crisis, and that's what they meant. But I've seen more than that. Most historians would say, of course, there was that. And I would say that's one of the most important ones. The rule of law is extremely important. And by the way, it's usually important to conservatives as much as liberals, right? It's not this sort of democratic thing. It's as Republican as it is democratic. And over again, you see in these schemes, Iran or the Contras, that they're being told by members of Congress, by lawyers, right? Certainly by members of, or the members of the cabinet, that you seem to be going into something, an area of the law that's really iffy, or in fact, it's really clear you're breaking laws, and these are all the laws you're probably going to be breaking. And the Reagan team, including Reagan, says, well, we think it's still worth it. Right? So they dismiss the rule of law very easily. And sometimes they'll just sort of admit it even after the scandal has broken. Um, Another important one is the obstruction of justice. This mostly happens once the behaviors are revealed, and then there's a clear cover-up. It's not necessarily coordinated by a bunch of people or conspiracy, but several people inside the administration are trying to keep documents from judges. They're trying to sort of, lie to investigators. They're doing all sorts of shenanigans that make it hard for those whose job it is to investigate crimes to actually find evidence, indict people, convict them. And it's one of the major reasons why essentially nobody pays a price 6, 7 years after this. Um, The fourth one, and the one I would say is probably the most fundamental to democracy, is truth, right? There's a lot of lying going on in Iran-Contra. Some of it makes some sense, right? If you're trying to deal with, you know, foreigners, terrorists, there's going to be some lying that happens. But this is carried to an extent that is totally unacceptable. And it's, it includes lying to members of Congress, which is a felony, right? Under oath or not under oath, it's a serious crime. And the CIA does it, members of the National Security Council do it. It's quite serious, and it comes out of that lack of respect for Congress. We're just like, and they they forge documents, so they destroy documents, which is also obstruction of justice, but in a sense, it's also lying. And then when the media discovers this, they just blame the media, right? So you're seeing a lot of what you're seeing today. Back then, and even back then in the 80s, members of Congress and journalists are warning, listen, if we cannot trust each other, right? Either, the Congress or the White House or the media or anybody else in Washington, if we're lying to each other, then there's no way we can persuade each other to do what the other one wants. And that's what politics is, right? And if you can't persuade something based on facts that you both agree are true, the only other way of getting them to do what you want them to do is through force. So truth is so fundamental because once you abandon it, the only recourse you have is force, right? To get what you want. Apart from that, there were quid pro quos with foreign nations. I'm trying to think of the sixth one. There was so many.
I
I'm
think I
forgetting.
I think I got it though. Isn't
Yes,
this, it's privatization, isn't it? Is it privatization?
privatization.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, yeah,
The privatization of war specifically, right?
yeah.
And so again, that's not necessarily a sin, but if you privatize, the reason that that's anti-democratic is that you're putting war, which is something public, right? It's something that governments do in the name of the people who elected them, and you're putting that in the hands of people who are not elected. And sometimes there's like massive profiteering that happens, and there's no record keeping, right? So nobody knows how much money people are making. And at the same time, people on the ground who are private actors start making decisions, right? They start telling the Contras where to attack or how much of this they should buy. And they start saying, I speak for Ronald Reagan. I speak for the government of the United States. And they absolutely do not, right? And that's just one small step towards, right, a much greater privatization that has happened now. I don't know if that answers the
Yeah,
question.
yeah, absolutely, and that's something in the latter portions of the book. I can't don't have the statistics off my head, but you bring out some statistics that really demonstrate the
Right.
significance of the privatization of American foreign policy. And as you document in the book, the Iran-Contra affair has the United States through private entities establishing shell accounts, Swiss bank accounts. They're interacting with international arms dealers, all in the pursuit of this end, of this quid pro quo, this exchange for weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages, and then the embezzlement, of course, of the funds to the Contras. One thing and so yeah, privatization, because it's very clear that that's a threat because of course private actors are not, held account to sort of the recourse of the will of the people. They're not held account by our processes. They're independent actors. One thing of all those, the one that I think Americans, just my feeling that Americans struggle with, and this goes back to the 2019 first impeachment of Trump and the no pro quo moment. I feel like I remember when that was going on, and my partner Jennifer and I were we were we were in New York actually on Long Island, and we were listening or watching the hearings with a close friend of ours, older individual, and we had these differing opinions, and it was like we were looking at this like, whoa, this is like, can you believe he did this? It's totally impeachable. But the other perspective was, it's not that bad really. And I think a lot of Americans look at the idea of a quid pro quo, and it's like this fine line. On the one hand, people might see it as, well, that's how you make deals. On the other hand, it's like this really important concept. Can you like talk just briefly, if you had to explain to someone, this is why you should care about the government using a quid pro quo to achieve like foreign policy aims. What would you
Yeah,
say to them?
that's a good question because I mean, of course, governments have always used, have always made deals with other governments. Um, and it's perfectly fine to say, we give you something, you give us something back. It doesn't need to necessarily be out in the open, right? Especially if you're doing it against a third government. Um, and especially, it's especially okay if the thing that you're doing, the policy that you're doing, the people know about it, right? Even though they don't know the details of every deal you're making, but they generally agree. Let's say it's just to free hostages, and the people generally agree freeing hostages is good, right? But then you're selling the missiles, and that's not cool, right? Because they don't want it done that way, because you yourself have said we're not going to do it that way, and then you secretly do it that way. Um, so what you're doing, though, is that you're putting a lot of power in the hands of people who not only are not elected by the American people, they're not even the American people. They're foreign governments. Um, I'll give you an example. Throughout Central America, so Nicaragua's in Central America, it has several neighbors who are also small Latin American countries. And the Contras are operating from those neighbors, right? Costa Rica, Honduras, especially, but they're also flying through Guatemala, flying through El Salvador. Military equipment is going through those countries. Each of those governments, I don't think Costa Rica as much, but the other three have quid pro quos with the United States, in which American policymakers are calling them quid pro quos. They're using that word. And they're promising, let's say, millions of dollars in military aid or economic aid if you let us use your base to fly weapons in and out to the Contras. And like I say, in like a legit war, it's okay to do that. But this is a secret war that the Congress has told you cannot wage this war. It's also a non-declared war. But most Americans think, well, the war in Central America is over in terms of American participation, but it's absolutely not. So it's lying, but it's also putting all this power in the hands of, let's say, Salvadorans, who then have something that they could blackmail the American president with. They could say, well, we have this secret because we know you've been moving red stuff through. And, they're not particularly a democratic country. They don't care their own people knowing that. They can reveal the secret unless the Americans give them more and more and more, right?
Yeah.
The Guatemalans, for instance, were doing fake end user agreements.
Hmm.
An end user agreement is essentially just like a list of cargo that comes off of a plane, and you, as the government of Guatemala, say, we are the end user. We are the ones who are going to use this equipment. It's not going through us. And so they would sign this, but it was going through them and it was going to the Contras in the countryside. So they were lying for the American government, but they could just call up the New York Times the next day and say, oh, look what we did. Your
Hmm.
president is fighting a secret war, right? A secret, undeclared, illegal war in Central America. And so quid pro quos can be really, really dangerous for both countries, really.
Yeah. Like looming in the background of all of this, um, was William Casey, the CIA director. And I wonder if you could just briefly touch on William Casey, his role in this, his contribution to the philosophy of like a unitary executive and these types of things. How does he factor into this story?
Yeah, O'Casey is one of the central characters, and I would say he's probably, as an agent of Iran-Contra, more central than Oliver North. Oliver North is his instrument, right? I mean, he's a middle manager of foreign policy. He's very competent. I would say he's even very patriotic. But he, shares a lot of ideas with Casey. Both of them, love Reagan, very anti-communist. Casey's director of the CIA. He had been a longtime friend of Reagan, helped him win the election. And he's someone who has grown to really hate the power of Congress. So obviously he's a CIA director, so he lies all the time. It's part of his job. But he especially resents the oversight that the Congress, or the few Congress people who are supposed to have oversight, the oversight that they have over covert operations. Covert operations are run by the CIA most of the time. And so in the early 80s, he's just very angry, calls them very nasty names, right? He lies to them, he withholds information from the CIA to the point where even Republican members of Congress are very angry, right? So they're taking off their Republican hat and putting on their, congressional hat and looking at the separation of powers and say, hey, why didn't you at least tell us you were doing this stuff, like bombing the ports of Nicaragua by employees of the CIA, right? We're not talking about arming the Contras here. It's like, we need to know if you were going at war or not, right? Can't lie to us like this. You can't dismiss our power. You have to tell us by law that you're doing this. And so when Congress cuts off funds to government agencies that are involved, this is the language, involved in intelligence, they're clearly got their sights set on the CIA, right? You can't say that the Central Intelligence Agency is not involved in intelligence. So Casey knows his time is up in terms of keeping the Contra war going. But he just walks down the hall to Oliver North and basically says, my agency can't fund the Contras. You, however, you work for the National Security Council. The National Security Council doesn't generally run operations. It sort of analyzes intelligence, recommends things to the president, writes reports, that sort of thing. That's what the NSC does. It's not really supposed to free hostages or engage in small wars, that sort of thing. And so he says, can you take this over? And Oliver North is only too happy to do this. He's already done stuff that's kind of like this. He's already doing the hostages thing too. So he's sort of the chosen instrument, right? And of course, the National Security Advisor, the immediate boss of Oliver North, and it's two men, one and then the other. Um, they seem to be generally fine with Oliver North, doing the day-to-day running of this secret war and the exchange of missiles for hostages. But Casey's kind of the mastermind behind it all.
Yeah, yeah,
Sometimes when you have members of the cabinet who are warning Reagan, they're warning their president not to do something. They're saying, we don't think you can sell missiles. It's illegal for all these reasons. Um, the Secretary of State says that. Secretary of Defense says that. Those guys never agree on anything, and they've agreed on this overwhelmingly. But then you have the National Security Advisor and then Bill Casey saying, well, we think we could find a way to do this. It's going to be legal-ish,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
then they get around. So he's just this kind of guy he hides information for a living. So it's completely natural for him to hide it also from the people who he's legally mandated to give that information to.
Yeah, in the book, something that like really jumps out, and I wonder if you think that this is one of the most, particularly in terms of larger pop culture, shall we say, perceptions about Reagan. It really jumps out that at least not necessarily with the embezzlement of funds to the Contras per se, but with the quid pro quo for hostages that Reagan's trying. I think historically, common knowledge in American culture was that, somehow Reagan was, eating jelly beans and falling asleep in National Security Council meetings and didn't really have this intimate knowledge. But when I read your book, it's like it really jumps out that no, he's actually it wouldn't happen without him. I mean, that's pretty. How do you weigh that in the significance of like revelations in this book, shall we say?
Yeah. I mean, I think Americans want to think good things about Reagan because he was such a genial person in public and even in private most of the time. He was perfectly genial. And I'll say, like, his motivation in doing this is not a bad motivation. I mean, he has actually seen how devastating the hostage taking was for Carter and for the whole country, right? And it is hard for a president to have Americans held hostage around the world and feel so powerless. You have such a huge military, and you've got these, maybe a dozen guys over here, a dozen guys over there holding two, three Americans. And it's like, why can't we, free these people? So it's very frustrating for him. I think emotionally, it's something that, breaks his heart. And so I completely understand that motivation, but it clearly goes against other motivations, right? And there's also the fact that Reagan he does lie a lot. I mean, if you read biographies of Reagan, it's amazing the extent to which he lied to people. And he was told that he was lying and he would keep doing it.
Mm,
And I think partly is that he lied to himself. He
mm,
liked to tell himself stories about his own life, about everything else that was going on.
mm.
And if anything went against the reality, he would just kind of forget about it,
Right.
right? And I don't know to what extent he had Alzheimer's at this point. From the meetings, I don't think much. He'd always been like this. He
Yeah.
would discard facts that were inconvenient to the thing that he wanted to achieve. And so in this case, it's really amazing that you've got top advisors telling him, Mr. President, don't do this. And partly what's going on is that the exchange of missiles for hostages and money is very complicated. The original idea actually comes out of Israel. So the Israelis are saying, hey, the Iranians and the Iraqis are at war. There's an 8-year war in the early 80s between those two countries, both Muslim countries, both enemies of Israel. And Israel's like, well, why don't we sell them some weapons? And Israel actually is thinking they'll get Iranian Jews out of Iran in exchange for these weapons too. So they've got their own, motivations, which again, not bad motivations. They're also thinking, why not have these two enemies of us fight each other more? So what happened is that the Israelis are the ones who are selling weapons to the Iranians originally. And then the Americans simply give the Israelis the same amount of weapons. So it wouldn't have happened, obviously, without the Israelis. Reagan is aware of all of this, and it's astounding. A year later, when this comes out in the public, Reagan has a press conference, and people say, "Hey, America sold weapons," and eventually America directly sells weapons to Iran. And he comes out in a press conference and says, "No, America never sold weapons to these terrorists." And everybody's just like, yes, you did, you know? And I mean, he was still under the impression that America had simply sold those weapons to the Israelis and the Israelis to the Iranians.
Mhm.
And so he's able to just turn that completely around. And there's a famous second, not a press conference, but sort of a speech to the nation in which he says, well, a month or so ago, I said that we had not sold weapons.
Yep.
My heart still tells me that we haven't. And people were just like, what do you mean your heart? You did do it. Doesn't matter what your heart is saying. But that goes to my original point, which is that his heart was very important for him. In many ways, he led with his heart more than his brain. And you can find that charming if you want, but again, not a great quality in a president, right? You want a president who actually knows what he did.
When he was um saying we didn't the first time you mentioned that, we said, well, we didn't sell weapons to Iran. Was he being like isolated from that, or like in terms of like, do you think he really believed we sold weapons to Israel and then what they did with it, that's their business? Or does he know that it goes through to Iran all the way and he's lying about that? If that makes sense.
It's hard to know what he thinks.
Yeah.
I mean, he did write, a memoir, obviously. He wrote a diary. People should go and see those things. I don't have the whole chronology exactly in my head, but there are several meetings at which people are saying, Mr. President, you realize we're going to be exchanging missiles for hostages. And he wants to be told that that's not true. And some are basically saying, well, it is going through the Israelis, so it's
Uh,
not really directly. And that's what he gloms onto. But people are saying, yeah, but it's still missiles that we originally gave the Israelis, and now it's going to terrorists. And they've got this like 28-point plan or something like that of like exchanging this many, hostages and then moving the missiles here and then moving them there, and it's very complicated. And people keep bringing up, okay, so our missiles for hostages plan is this, and Reagan keeps saying at these meetings, no, 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 we're not exchanging missiles for hostages. And part of the rationale is that he's selling missiles. He's hoping that that's going to simply create goodwill in the Iranian government, maybe even open up the Iranian government, maybe democratize it. I mean, that's a crazy thing, but at least help relations with the United States so that they're not seen as the great Satan anymore. And maybe out of that, hostages are freed. for the Iranians keep saying, okay, you give us 1,000 missiles, we'll free one hostage. They're being very clear-eyed about this. And Reagan is just living in this dream world where he's not breaking the law, right? So it's like, I'm sorry, but that's not an excuse, right? Not knowing that you've broken the law, especially when you've been told you're breaking the law over and over again. You can't just say, well, to me, I wasn't breaking the law. That doesn't fly in any legal context. So I don't buy it.
So I have two more questions. If we have the time. The first one, like we kind of started thinking a little bit about this, and this one relates to like kind of why was the Iran-Contra affair like trivialized? And on the one hand, it's like you mentioned earlier, it's like, well, Reagan's not impeached. He doesn't do a Nixon where he's going to get impeached and he resigns. He kind of rides off into the sunset and is remembered in these romanticized terms ultimately. But I also think about like, what about the perpetrators, right? Because all this stuff, as you document so well, the numerous cases, all of the nuanced details about who was doing what to make this illegal enterprise happen. And so I look at that and it's like, it's such an odd thing because you have individuals that I mean, G. Gordon Liddy went to prison for 10 years, right? And you could argue that in a certain respect, what Oliver North is doing, might be worse than some of the things that G. Gordon Liddy was doing. I guess that would just be a debate about what you believe is worse. But the point is like, it almost made Oliver North's career. He almost became a senator of Virginia. He published more than one book on the topic. It might have won awards. A program on, I think it was Fox War Stories or something like this. Um, and I think as you document, I want to say, was it only Richard Secord who actually had any kind of, I mean,
Yeah.
punishment to speak about, really? So why do you think that is? Why don't the actual perpetrators have any kind of real account for this? And what does it say about what's happening in America at the time?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, let me say that the reason that most of the punishment evaporates is because George H.W. Bush pardons everybody who is still somewhere in legal jeopardy on Christmas Eve 1992, when he's already lost his reelection and it's the day before Christmas. So the news is going to come out on Christmas when nobody's looking at TV, right? Nobody's reading the newspapers. So they time it because they know this is politically embarrassing. But there's people who've been indicted, people who are going to be indicted, people who have already been convicted, they're about to be charged. I mean, they're about to be sentenced. There's like 6 or 7 of these guys, and they've been in court for years. And he pardons them all, right? So that's one of the main reasons that there's no consequences for these folks. There is one guy, I think it's Thomas Klein's,
That's it. Yeah.
who was a friend of Secord, and
Right.
he is sentenced to 6 months in prison, and actually serves 6 months in prison uh, for tax evasion. Right, he took money he was supposed to pay taxes. He didn't. It's a relatively minor crime. But even if all the folks charged and indicted had not been pardoned, it's a really, really small number of people who are indicted compared to the number of people who've actually committed crimes, right? And of course, I'm saying committed crimes. They're not indicted, they're not convicted, so I can't officially say they committed crimes. But certainly the people investigated by the Office of Independent Counsel, and that's the office that's meant to investigate crimes, not truth, right? Just crimes. They find hundreds of people. They investigate hundreds of people who've done all sorts of things that clearly could be, you know, shown to be crimes. Could they be proved in court? Sometimes no. You just don't have enough documents, or they decide, they being the office, decide not to prosecute them because they're not big enough fish, or what they did was clearly a crime, but they can't really prove it, or they just don't have the budget to go after all these people and pursue them for years. So they go after the most important people. So clearly Oliver North is one of them. But then what happens is that a lot of the crimes don't have clear punishments attached to them. The Boland Amendment is a perfect example of this. The Boland Amendment is the amendment that Congress passes that cuts off the funds to the Contras. There's no punishment. There's no criminal, punishment attached to it. So if you break that law, you can try it under some sort of obscure law, but even the lawyers who were supposed to try it, they're like, we don't really know what to do with this. They went against the letter, the spirit of the Bowen Amendment, but what crime is it exactly? So there's a sort of naivete of Congress to think like, hey, if we just say you can't do something, people won't do it, right? And the fact that, what we're now experiencing with the Trump administration is exactly this, is an administration that realizes, wow, we can break a bunch of laws and there's no clear criminal path to being punished, right? Um, so, on top of the fact that laws are a little wishy-washy, it's hard to indict them. There's a lot of obstruction of justice going on, which is not official obstruction of justice, but clearly people in the government don't want to produce documents, right? And this is happening over and over and over again. And it's inherently dangerous in national security cases. There's something called gray mailing. So in the case of Oliver North and many others, their legal defense from their lawyers is basically saying, hey, you want to try us and say that we made major decisions that broke laws, but we are taking the Nuremberg defense. We were taking orders from the National Security Advisor, who's taking orders from Reagan, and therefore we didn't do anything illegal. We're just taking orders. In order to show that, we have to show a pattern that we've been taking orders from the president for years, and therefore we need to declassify 1 million pages of documents.
Mm.
And they say this to a judge, and the judge is just like, "Oh my God, really? You want to declassify 1 million pages?" But he wants to give them a fair trial, So there's this negotiation of like, "Well, how about 100,000?" Okay, and then they start declassifying that, and that's taking like 2 years, right? And it's like, well, okay, how about 50,000? How about 3,000? And they start all this negotiation. Eventually, Oliver North is saying, no, 3,000 doesn't cut it. I can't get a fair trial. We're asking for a mistrial. All of this takes years and years. And eventually it actually goes up to a committee that is made up of the vice president or a national security advisor. These guys have to decide whether they're going to let courts see documents where they figure, right? It's a clear conflict of interest. And they just say, no, we're not going to do that.
Mm.
These are national security documents. We claim national security. And so journalists are just like, wow,
Wow.
so in national security, you just have to play this card, this gray mailing card,
Mm.
ask to declassify all this stuff. It's not going to happen. You can't get a fair trial, mistrial. You're free to go, right?
Wow.
I mean, I'll say the
Wow.
one sort of real consequence for anybody who is dragged through these cases are the lawyer fees. I mean, they're
Yeah.
paying lawyers
True.
$400 an hour and through for years and teams of lawyers. I've seen some of these invoices from lawyers. Some of these men are paying millions of dollars over a couple of years or 5, 6 years of being pursued by the government, right? Which has essentially unlimited budgets. So if there's any incentive to not do this again, it's not the criminal punishment, it's poverty,
Mm.
right? Is that you can get really, really poor. So this answers the other part of your question, which is like Oliver North becomes rich out of this. How does he do that? So partly it's because he's seen as this sort of like anti-government hero, right? He's a patriot. He goes against the wimps in the Congress, right? He wants to win a war and not be restrained by the people who are trying to oversee and the bureaucrats and so on. He's a man of action, gets it done. Whatever. That's perfectly fine, legitimate way to think. Um, so he becomes a hero to a lot of Americans. I'd say about half Americans, right? They largely forget about him, but then he actually turns that into a political career and then a media career. This sort of like attacking of the media, and turning scandalous behavior into fame, right? He's one of the first who sort of does this in the 80s. And I've actually wrote an article about this in which I argue like this becomes sort of a new, specifically Republican model of saying, I don't feel any shame about this. I do not accept your shaming of me. And in fact, I am now, a more famous, right, or infamous person. And then you run on your notoriety. And in fact, he runs for the
Mm.
Senate in Virginia in 1994. He actually wins a nomination for the Republican Party, but then he loses by a couple of points and a Democrat wins. But he would have been the Republican Senator of Virginia. And even at that point, he's kind of a media star. And then Fox News, like you said, sort of adopts him as a talking head. He does all these documentaries, and they're perfectly fine documentaries about military equipment and nostalgia and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I don't begrudge him, making a career
Yeah.
because he couldn't be in government anymore,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah.
But he certainly went from like a middle managing guy who had a very ordinary career and salary to somebody who was a hero of the right.
Yeah. Hmm. It's fascinating, and it's a really fascinating book. And maybe if we'll close with just one like 2026 question, and that is, I heard an academic, not a historian like us, but an academic, senior academic, and they referred to the United States as having entered something akin to like a Roman imperial phase, meaning that they were suggesting that we were transitioning into like almost like a post-constitutional state, if you will.
Yeah.
Where do you think we're at in terms of this democratic crisis? This book does such a great job of establishing these really important antecedents for the 21st century democratic crisis that America finds itself in. Where do you think we're at? And the last thing, when people read your book, and people should buy the book because it's great. Um, what would you like people to take away more than anything else?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I did conceive of the book as having sort of two roles. The first is sort of just a primer on Iran-Contra, right? You've heard of it, you don't really understand it. You want a book that is not very long. Most books are 400, 500, 600 pages. This one is about 250. You get the whole scandal, right? Not every single detail of it, but you're going to get enough to know what it is. So part of it is that, but part of it is this argument that's relevant to the present about democracy. Um, and I'm saying that this is not the first time that foreign policy makers have abused their power or have done things that are undemocratic. And the whole introduction is like a list of things they've done before Reagan. The conclusion is stuff that they've done since. But I do, argue that this one assembles together a lot of undemocratic behaviors and sort of an assault on many democratic norms, and really accelerates them, right? Partly because it's pretty extreme and there's no consequences. And so the only thing you learn is don't get caught, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But even if you do get caught, especially under Trump, you can just get pardoned, right? And I mean, we've seen Trump say over and over again to advisors, do this terrible thing for me, and they go, well, it's kind of risky, and they go, I'll pardon you. Don't worry about it. I'm not sure I would trust him that he would pardon folks, but he certainly has pardoned lots of political friends.
yeah,
So it's very, very possible. Um, I think we are much further down the road of not being a democracy anymore. I mean, all the indexes of democracy show us sliding very quickly, backsliding very quickly. Um, the good thing is most Americans, I think, are aware of this, right? They're seeing the dangers. Now, I have to say that Iran-Contra did not point to all the dangers that we're now seeing, right? These are mostly sort of foreign policy type behaviors. Um, Much greater dangers are not having an election anymore, which we're now seeing, right? We're now seeing steps towards not believing elections and then, creating the illusion that we shouldn't believe in elections. And then, right, talk of nationalizing the elections, talk of having the personal shock troops of the president oversee ballot
yeah,
boxes. This is all stuff that you've seen in undemocratic countries that pretended to have elections,
yeah,
like in places like Latin America in 20th century. People did this all the time. Luckily, the United States has a very decentralized election system, but if the overall point is that if you degrade norms of any kind that have to do with democracy, people just have less and less faith that democracy can work for them, right? And it's been a long time now that the American voter simply has lost faith in politicians. And I would say, people accuse me of being partisan, but there's one party, the Republican Party, that is programmatically anti-government. And its job when it gets in government is to make government not work,
yeah,
right? It doesn't produce things for American people. It doesn't produce the common good, right? We
yeah,
just saw Trump basically stripped the EPA of having the responsibility of fighting climate change, right? That's a clear example of government saying, we're not going to do anything for the people anymore. So then the people see this, and then the Republicans go up for election again and go, oh, government's not working, elect us, right? So, throw the bums out, elect us, these people who
Yep.
don't come from the system.
Yep.
And so voters do this over and over again. They elect the anti-government party, but that party breaks down the government every time they do, and it just creates this cycle.
Yeah.
We've done that for a long time, and and there's a clear erosion of truth, much greater than back then. Just give you a little vignette of this is that back then, almost everybody in the Iran-Contra scandal who heard about it had more or less the same set of facts before them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And even the opinions didn't differ much, right? You'd have maybe more liberal newspapers like the Post or the New York Times saying, well, we think these are pretty serious crimes. And then you'd have the Washington Times or the National Review would say, well, this is criminal behavior, but we don't think it's that serious. So at least they agreed on facts, And then someone would say, well, it is serious. Someone would say it's not serious, you know that's fine. That's a perfectly legitimate debate. And now you have a media environment that completely ignores,
Yep.
right? Where some are completely ignoring coverage of very, very important thing, or if they're covering it, they're just lying it, or they're spinning it so much that it doesn't have any relationship with reality anymore. And so, yeah, we've gone far down the path of, degrading truth and therefore trust in each other.
Yeah. Well, Alan McPherson, thank you so much. It was a real honor to have you on the program. The book is The Breach, and Iran-Contra and the Assault on American Democracy. This is a great book. I really encourage anybody who listens to this, you should buy this book or go to your library, but you should read it. It's a real informative piece that we should all be reading and paying attention to. And thank you, Alan McPherson, for coming on and talking to us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
All right.